Good evening to all. I hope I am audible to you. Good evening to all. I hope I am audible to you. Good evening to all. I hope I am audible to you. Good evening to all. I hope I am audible to you. Good evening to all. I hope I am audible to you. Good evening to all. I hope I am audible to you. Good evening to all. I hope I am audible to you. चलो, आई थिंक आई एम ऑडिबल एंड आज जो सेशन कल का जो बाकी था वो सेशन कंप्लीट कर लेंगे. तो वी वाज डिस्कसिंग अबाउट द रिसेप्टर्स. We was discussing about the receptors, and there are 4 type of receptor, as I told you: ion channel or ligand gated ion channel or inotropic receptor. Second receptor is nothing but the G protein coupled receptor. Third receptor is nothing but the enzyme receptor or tyrosine kinase receptor or JAK-STAT receptor. So GPCR is also known as G protein coupled receptor, also known as a metabotropic, also known as a heptahelical, also known as a serpentine receptor, also known as a 7 transmembrane spanning protein receptor. And type 3 is known as a enzyme receptor or tyrosine kinase receptor or JAK-STAT receptor. Type 4 receptor is known as a intracellular receptor or nuclear receptor or receptor that regulate the gene transcription. Okay, so we have seen that, or hormonal receptor, right? So after that we have also seen this table. This table is important. So remember, inotropic is the fastest acting. After that GPCR, after that that tyrosine kinase receptor, and type 4, that is nuclear receptor, that is the slowest acting. Remember the examples. I already told you, you have to remember the examples. Then synonyms are very important. Receptor and their synonyms, then examples, and then secondary messengers for GPCR, and also they have already asked question on a tertiary messenger for GPCR. Okay, so a lot of times they already asked question. So next is nothing but the, I have told you, we have seen this also. And types of receptor, first one is the ion channel receptor, so, or inotropic receptor, agonist or a drug which stimulate the receptor. Okay, agonist plus receptor, so combination of a agonist with the ion channel receptor, that is a leads to change in the permeability of ions. So either sodium will go inside the cell, causes depolarization, or calcium goes, causes depolarization or stimulation, or chloride opens, and that causes the hyperpolarization and depression. So depolarization leads to stimulation, hyperpolarization leads to inhibition. Second one is the GPCR. We have seen G protein coupled receptor or metabotropic receptor or heptahelical or serpentine receptor. So these are the named GPCR because they are having G proteins, guanosine. They are bound to a inner surface of the plasma membrane. They have different subunits. उनमें subunits होते alpha, beta, gamma. They are in a group. They are in a association. Upon when a ligand will bind to a GPCR, these subunit dissociates, these subunit separates, and G proteins are the activated. Now these G proteins act via secondary messengers. They causes the change in the cell function via secondary messengers. GPCR में जो G प्रोटीन है वो नाम कहाँ से आता है? G प्रोटीन नेम इज गिवन because they interact with the guanine nucleotides. They interact with the guanine nucleotide. For example, GTP, GDP. Now these proteins, G proteins are of different type. So GS, GI, GQ. GS and GQ जो होता है that is stimulatory in nature. GI is inhibitory in nature. Now effector pathway is also important for GPCR. है ना? What are the effector pathway? इसके ऊपर क्वेश्चन आता ही आता है. What are the effector pathways? Already एक बार आ चुका है. So there are different effector pathways. G protein coupled receptor effector pathways. First one is nothing but the adenyl cyclase pathway. So stimulation of GPCR, okay, particularly GS stimulation होता है, that will activate the adenyl cyclase and it will metabolize the ATP to AMP. It will convert ATP to cyclic AMP so that intracellular level of cyclic AMP will increase, and also act via protein kinase, which causes the phosphorylation of protein. There is a regulation of cell function. Action जो होता है, for example, actions like a contraction of muscle, relaxation of muscle, lipolysis, hormone synthesis. These actions are mediated by adenyl cyclase pathway. Second pathway is there known as a phospholipase C/IP3-DAG pathway. तब क्या है? Phospholipase C inositol 3-phosphate DAG pathway. So this pathway is for GQ. Okay, when there is a stimulation of GPCR or particular GQ proteins are stimulated, then that activate the phospholipase C enzyme. के नाम में रखा है phospholipase, means phospholipid को break down करेगा. Phospholipid lipase break down the phospholipids and convert inositol diphosphate to inositol 3-phosphate, and also produces the diacyl glycerol DAG from the membrane phospholipids. Now जो inositol 3-phosphate है, that will mobilize the calcium ions from smooth endoplasmic reticulum, and it will free the calcium so that intracellular level of calcium will be increased, which will bring about the secretion from endocrine glands, exocrine gland, contraction of muscle, metabolism, hyperpolarization. Okay, it will also act on ion channels. Diacyl glycerol activate the protein kinase C, which ultimately regulate the cell function. Now third pathway is their direct stimulation of ion channel. So activated G protein transmit a signal to some ions, say for example potassium. Activated G protein send a signal to some ion channels, causing opening or closing, resulting in the depolarization or hyper. This pathway we have seen when a drug will combine with the receptor, drug receptor complex will be there. There is a activation of G protein. Now which G protein will activate? Suppose if G stimulatory GS is activated. If GS is activated, that activate the adenyl cyclase enzyme, which convert ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP causes the phosphorylation, which stimulate the protein kinase and causes the phosphorylation of proteins, that leads to effect. If there is a stimulation of GQ, it activates the phospholipase C. Phospholipase C is a breakdowns the phospholipids and convert IP2 into IP3. IP3 will mobilize the calcium from sarcoplasmic reticulum, increases the intercellular calcium level. Okay, then DAG जो है, that is from also phospholipid. DAG activate the protein kinase and will get a effect. We have seen that. We have also seen this. So suppose if this is a cell membrane, and if agonist bind to the GPCR, so there is a if stimulation of GS protein, it will activate the adenyl cyclase, that will convert ATP into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP will stimulate the protein kinase enzyme, causes the phosphorylation. It causes the phosphorylation of different enzymes, carrier proteins. Then also stimulate the troponin to cause cellular functions. Also, if there is an activation of GQ protein by a agonist, will release of phospholipase C. Phospholipase C will break down the phospholipids, convert into IP3 and DAG. IP3 will mobilize the intracellular calcium, and DAG will cause phosphorylation different protein via protein kinase. Will go to give it a different activities of cell, like contraction and secretion of enzyme, activation, cellular functions. Now, third type of enzyme, third type of receptor is nothing but the enzyme receptor. Third type of receptor is nothing but the enzyme receptor, also known as the JAK-STAT receptor, tyrosine kinase receptor, also known as a receptor tyrosine kinase, or also known as enzyme receptor or type 3 receptor. इसके ऊपर क्वेश्चन आ चुका है कि which of the following is associated with the enzyme tyrosine kinase. Which of the following receptor is enzyme? Which of the following question क्या था? Which of the following receptor is associated with the enzyme tyrosine kinase? So it's a enzyme receptor or tyrosine kinase receptor or kinase linked receptor. They will bind an extracellular ligand binding site. So this kind of receptor, ये जो receptor होते हैं enzyme receptor, इसमें दो side होता है, extracellular ligand binding site and intracellular domain for catalytic activity. Intracellular and extracellular जो domain है, that is bind by single peptide, is linked by single peptide. Binding of agonist or ligand to the type 3 receptor causes the autophosphorylation of intercellular domain and in intense phosphorylation of various intracellular enzymes and proteins, which produces the response. Type 4 receptor क्या होता है? Intracellular receptor or nuclear receptor or cytoplasmic receptor or receptor that regulate the gene transcription, or type 4 intracellular receptor, nuclear receptor, cytoplasmic receptor, receptor that regulate the gene transcription, also known as a hormonal receptor, also known as a hormonal receptor. So ये क्या है? These receptors, activation of these receptor leads to or drug that activate the receptor regulate the gene transcription or transcription factors against agonist that binds or activate the receptor, and this receptor complex, agonist receptor complex, then it is transported in the cell into the nucleus, where this complex interact with the DNA and regulate the gene transcription that increase or decrease in a specific protein to regulate the cell activity. जैसे हार्मोनल रिसेप्टर होते हैं, हार्मोनल रिसेप्टर जो हार्मोन के से एक्ट होते हैं, हार्मोन विल इंटरेक्ट विद द टाइप 4 रिसेप्टर दैट कॉम्प्लेक्स विल बी ट्रांसपोर्टेड अक्रॉस द सेल इनटू द न्यूक्लियस. इन न्यूक्लियस ये डीएनए के साथ इंटरेक्ट करेंगे, जीन ट्रांसक्रिप्शन करेंगे और वो रेगुलेट करेंगे कि कोई प्रोटीन का सिंथेसिस कम करना है, ज़्यादा करना है. वो हार्मोनल रिसेप्टर एंड विटामिन डी रिसेप्टर एक्ट वाया टाइप 4. You can see over here again in a flow diagram type. So type 3 receptor, how type 3 receptor will produces the response. The extracellular domain of receptor agonist will bind to extracellular domain of receptor, and they say insulin है, insulin will bind to the type 3 receptor. There is a autophosphorylation of intracellular domain, activation of tyrosine kinase, serine kinase, guanyl kinase, etc. Then entry of glucose from extracellular fluid to intracellular fluid. That is insulin receptor or platelet derived growth factor एपिडर्मल फैक्टर ग्रोथ रिसेप्टर। तब इंसुलिन रिसेप्टर है ना, प्लेटलेट डिराइव्ड ग्रोथ फैक्टर रिसेप्टर, एपिडर्मल ग्रोथ फैक्टर रिसेप्टर, ये सब क्या है? दे आर द टाइप 3 रिसेप्टर। और टाइप 4 रिसेप्टर कैसे एक्ट होंगे? रिसेप्टर एंड लिगैंड, agonist receptor, that will form a receptor complex. So attachment of this, the responsive DNA, then formation of enzymes, protein or gene expression. Example, estrogen, progesterone, androgens. मतलब hormones act via type 4 receptor ना. So for example, how type 2 receptor acts? जैसे GPCR receptor plus agonist. रिसेप्टर है आपका बीटा रिसेप्टर, एगोनिस्ट है आपका एड्रेनालिन. तो एड्रेनालिन इंटरेक्ट विद बीटा रिसेप्टर, causes the activation of GS protein, stimulate activation of adenyl cyclase. ATP is converted into cyclic, increase the cyclic AMP in the cell, leads to stimulation of protein kinase in the cytoplasm. You will get a biological effect like muscle contraction and relaxation, secretions of gland, then change in the membrane permeability, change in the membrane pumps opening, and new hormone enzyme synthesis. These are the effect of type 2. Now important terms to understand that regarding the receptor. मतलब रिसेप्टर का जो ड्रग इंटरेक्ट करता है वो ड्रग के टर्म्स क्या है? इंपॉर्टेंट टर्म्स टू अंडरस्टैंड drug receptor interaction. So है ना, there are term, drug may be either agonist, drug which interact with the receptor may be either agonist, partial agonist, inverse agonist, antagonist. तो जो ड्रग है आपका वो ड्रग may be either act as a agonist or partial agonist or inverse agonist or antagonist. So drug may interact with the receptor and depending upon its intrinsic activity. So there are 4 terms. First one is agonist. So agonist क्या है? Agonist is a kind of drug. It is a kind of drug, a molecule which initiate the pharmacological response after the binding to a receptor. So agonist is a drug which bind to a receptor and initiate the pharmacological response. It's also known as a full agonist or full agonist. So agonist जो है, it has a high affinity. Affinity means ability to combine with the receptor and high intrinsic activity. So it is a response produced after the interacting with the receptor. तो agonist क्या होता है? वो receptor के साथ में interact करता है एंड फुल एक्शन दिखाता है, तो उसको बोलते हैं एगोनिस्ट और फुल एगोनिस्ट. उसको क्या होता है कि हैज अ हाई एफिनिटी एंड इंट्रिंसिक एक्टिविटी. तो एगोनिस्ट की इंट्रिंसिक एक्टिविटी यू कैन से और इट कैन बी डिनोटेड लाइक IA is equal to +1. Means a full agonist has a intrinsic activity in a plus or in a plus side. Now what do you mean by partial agonist? Partial agonist means what? Has a equal or less affinity like a pure agonist or full agonist, but as it is a name indicate, as name indicate partial, so it has a partial intrinsic activity. So but so it has a less or equal affinity, but definitely it has a less intrinsic activity than a pure agonist or full agonist. For example, pindolol is a partial agonist to the beta 1 receptor. Intrinsic activity of partial agonist. Intrinsic activity of partial agonist can be said that it is in between -1 to +1. इसके ऊपर क्वेश्चन आ चुका है. तो पार्शियल एगोनिस्ट इंट्रिंसिक एक्टिविटी कितना होता है? +1 to -1, -1 to +1 है ना. So examples of full agonist, so adrenaline, noradrenaline to the alpha receptor, beta receptor, acetylcholine to the muscarinic receptor, nicotinic receptor, histamine to the histaminergic receptor, serotonin to the serotoninergic receptor. तो ये सब क्या है, फुल एगोनिस्ट है और एगोनिस्ट है, या फिर प्योर एगोनिस्ट है. तो पार्शियल एगोनिस्ट मतलब क्या, एज अ इक्वल और लेस एफिनिटी बट डेफिनेटली एज अ partial intrinsic activity, less intrinsic activity. Remember the example question already पूछा है एक बार. तो Pindolol is a partial agonist. के ऊपर क्वेश्चन ऑलरेडी आ चुका है. Pindolol is a partial agonist. Pindolol is a partial agonist to the beta 1 receptor, and intrinsic activity of partial agonist is equal to -1 to +1. It is in between -1 to +1. So partial agonist. Now inverse agonist is another term. Inverse agonist क्या है ना, inverse agonist means opposite to the full agonist. Is opposite to the full agonist. Agonist क्या करता है, it will combine with the receptor and will activate, will increase the intrinsic activity ना. Inverse agonist क्या है, it can also activate the receptor but it will produce a opposite action to that of the pure agonist or full agonist ना. जैसे मान लीजिए noradrenaline by interacting with the beta receptor increases the blood pressure. It's a full agonist. Partial agonist क्या होगा, वो उतना एक्टिव नहीं दिखाएगा. Inverse agonist क्या होगा, वो opposite activity दिखाएगा. So what do you mean by inverse agonist? Inverse agonist can activate the receptor but opposite action is there. Yeah. For example, you see, example is very important, and example is a beta carbolin. Example क्या है, beta carbolin. Example is a beta carbolin which is the inverse agonist to the benzodiazepine receptor. Benzodiazepine receptor का pure agonist कौन है, diazepam. Diazepam is a pure agonist to the benzodiazepine receptor. By interacting with the benzodiazepine receptor, diazepam causes the depression of CNS, right? But beta carbolin, as it is the inverse agonist, will combine with the benzodiazepine receptor and causes the CNS stimulation, you know, opposite effect to that of the pure agonist. Beta carbolin is a CNS depression करता है by interacting with the benzodiazepine. diazepam क्या करता है, डाइज़ेपाम क्या करता है, सीएनएस डिप्रेशन करता है, एंड बीटा कार्बोलिन क्या करता है, सीएनएस स्टिमुलेशन करता है. सो फुल एगोनिस्ट इंटरेक्ट विद द रिसेप्टर एंड प्रोड्यूसेस द फुल इफेक्ट. इंट्रिंसिक एक्टिविटी इज इन अ प्लस, दैट इज अ +1. फुल एगोनिस्ट इज आल्सो नोन एज अ प्योर एगोनिस्ट और एगोनिस्ट और सिंपली agonist or full agonist or pure agonist. Partial agonist means it will interact with the receptor, will produces partial effect. Intrinsic activity of partial agonist is between -1 to +1. के ऊपर क्वेश्चन ऑलरेडी आ चुका है. एग्जाम्पल के ऊपर क्वेश्चन ऑलरेडी आ चुका है. Pindolol is a partial agonist to the beta 1 receptor, beta 1 adrenergic receptor. Now inverse agonist is a opposite to that of full agonist, so it can activate the receptor but produces the opposite effect of the pure agonist. जैसे मान लीजिए, एग्जाम्पल इज अ बीटा कार्बोलिन टू द बेंजोडाइजेपिन रिसेप्टर. बेंजोडाइजेपिन रिसेप्टर को फुल एगोनिस्ट कौन है, डाइजेपाम. क्या करता है, डाइजेपाम विल इंटरेक्ट विद द बेंजोडाइजेपिन रिसेप्टर एंड डिप्रेसेस द CNS. बट बीटा कार्बोलिन interact with the benzodiazepine receptor and causes CNS stimulation. That's why opposite effect to the diazepam. Inverse agonist and its intrinsic activity is in a minus. Opposite होता है तो minus में intrinsic. Now another term is antagonist. It is a drug that binds with the receptor and causes the receptor blockage. ये receptor के साथ में combine होके receptor का block करता है. It causes the blockage to the receptor. So agonist has a, antagonist has a, antagonist may have same affinity to that of the pure agonist but no intrinsic activity for the receptor. So that's why intrinsic activity of antagonist is equal to 0. तो याद रखो, intrinsic activity of full agonist is in a +1, partial agonist is between -1 to +1, inverse agonist that is definitely -1, and antagonist is equal to 0. These terms are very important, you have to understand, and nobody will tell you these things. आपके कॉलेज में आपको जो फार्माकोलॉजी पढ़ाया इसमें भी ये नहीं पढ़ाया होगा, ये GPAT में आता है, it is important in GPAT. That's why I have collected this information from 3-4 standard reference books, and I used to share with you, I used to explain with you, I used to explain to you, as it is important for GPAT Niper DI Pharmacist. Now you see same thing in a diagram. Okay, so if you plot a response, receptor response, you can see intrinsic activity, you can see intrinsic activity on a y-axis and concentration of drug on x-axis, and you see this dotted line is basal activity. Dotted line is a basal activity of receptor, right? Now a drug or a agent which combine with the receptor and produces the full effect or high intrinsic activity in a +1. Drug which combine with the receptor has a affinity and has a intrinsic activity, full affinity and full intrinsic activity, known as a full agonist. Drug is known as a full agonist. If drug combines with the receptor with the full or less affinity, but has a definitely less intrinsic activity, partial agonist, between -1 to so drug which combines with the receptor and produces the partial effect, known as a partial agonist. Drug which combines the receptor and produces the opposite effect, that is produced by full agonist. तो फुल एगोनिस्ट प्लस में इफेक्ट दिखाता है ना, इनवर्स एगोनिस्ट माइनस में दिखाता है. So if drug combines with the receptor and produces the opposite effect to that of the pure agonist, known as the inverse agonist. Receptor, drug which blocks the receptor, known as antagonist. Antagonist not have intrinsic activity. So these are the different terms related to drug receptor interaction. तो ये बहुत सारी जगह पे आपको मिलेगा ना. एंटागोनिस्ट इज आल्सो नोन एज अ ब्लॉकर. ब्लॉकर टाइप के ड्रग होते हैं, रिसेप्टर ब्लॉकर हो गए तो एंटागोनिस्ट ही होते हैं. स्टिमुलेंट जो है उसको बोलते हैं एगोनिस्ट. एगोनिस्ट और स्टिमुलेंट, एंटागोनिस्ट और ब्लॉकर. Now here I will like to explain you what do you mean by antagonism, what are the types of antagonism, what do you mean by competitive antagonism, what do you mean by non-competitive antagonism, what do you mean by drug potentiation. तो यहाँ पे देखो, if you plot a drug response versus log dose, is log dose versus drug response curve. Log dose on x-axis and percentage of response on a y-axis. So here, okay, so what do you mean by full agonist, and what do you mean by more potent drug, means potency. What do you mean by competitive antagonism, what do you mean by non-competitive antagonism. Suppose this one is a full agonist. ये क्या है? This is a full agonist. Full agonist. Full agonist means what? Will combine with the receptor and will produce a full effect. It is a full agonist. Okay. Now, if low, suppose that this is a dose. Dose कितना है इसका? Suppose 10 milligram. If the dose of full agonist is a 10 milligram, and if less dose of drug is required, if लेस डोज ऑफ ड्रग इज रिक्वायर्ड टू प्रोड्यूस द सेम इफेक्ट. मान लीजिए यहाँ पे 1 milligram. So if only 1 milligram dose is required to produce the same effect which is produced by full agonist, so that drug is known as a more potent. मान लीजिए एक है ना, ये बी ड्रग है, ड्रग कौन सा है, बी. ये फुल एगोनिस्ट को बोलेंगे अपन ए ड्रग. डोज ऑफ ए इज अ 10 milligram to produce this effect, but dose of B is only 1 milligram to produce the same effect. So drug B is more potent than drug A. B is more potent than drug A, and the phenomenon of this phenomenon is known as a potentiation. Phenomenon is known as a potentiation. So shifting of log dose response curve towards the left side is known as a potentiation. डेफिनेशंस इंपॉर्टेंट है, क्वेश्चन आता है इसके ऊपर. तो शिफ्टिंग है ना, ये जो कर्व है, ये जो आपका प्लॉट है लॉग डोज वर्सेस रिस्पॉन्स ना, शिफ्टिंग ऑफ दिस लॉग डोज वर्सेस रिस्पॉन्स कर्व टूवर्ड्स द लेफ्ट साइड known as a potentiation, okay. And shifting of this log dose versus log dose versus log dose response curve towards the right side known as antagonism. Shifting of this log dose versus response curves towards the left side known as a potentiation, and shifting towards the right side known as a antagonism. Okay. Now shifting towards the right side may be either parallel or non-parallel. तो ये log dose response curve जो है, log dose response curve as compared to full agonist. So full agonist है as compared to full agonist, shifting of this curve towards the left side known as a potentiation, and shifting of this curve towards the right side known as a antagonism. Right. Now if any other drug which has a structural similarity to the agonist, दूसरा कोई ड्रग है इसका स्ट्रक्चरल सिमिलरिटी किसके साथ में, एगोनिस्ट के साथ में है, एगोनिस्ट के साथ, and if that drug shifts the dose response curve towards the right side in a parallel manner, so competitive antagonist will shift a log dose versus response curve towards the right side in a parallel way known as a competitive antagonist. Competitive antagonist क्या करेगा, जो लॉन्ग डोज रिस्पॉन्स कर्व है उसको राइट साइड में शिफ्ट करेगा इन अ पैरेलल, है ना, इन अ पैरेलल मैनर, दैट इज नोन एज अ कॉम्पिटिटिव एंटागोनिस्ट. एंड इफ ड्रग शिफ्ट द लॉन्ग डोज रिस्पॉन्स कर्व टुवर्ड्स द राइट साइड इन अ नॉन पैरेलल वे नोन एज अ नॉन कॉम्पिटिटिव एंटागोनिस्ट. देखो तो है ना, दिस कॉम्पिटिटिव एंटागोनिस्ट इज शिफ्टिंग log dose response curve towards the right side in a parallel way. That's why competitive antagonist is shifting towards the right side, no doubt, but in a non-parallel way, so non-competitive antagonist, right? So remember, when you plot a drug response curve, so shifting of, if you plot a log dose versus response curve as compared to full agonist, if a drug shifts a log dose response curve towards the left side known as a potentiation, means if a less dose of drug is required to produce the same effect which is produced by full agonist known as a more potent drug, and shifting of drug response curve towards the right side known as a antagonism. If it shift via parallel way known as a competitive antagonism, and if it is if drug is shifting that log dose response curve towards the right side in a non-parallel way known as a non-competitive antagonism. I hope you have understood it. You can see over here. Okay, so here is the example: drug A, drug B, drug C, and drug D. So suppose this drug B is a full agonist. अगर drug B क्या है? Is a agonist. So then drug A will be more potent. Drug A is a more potent. Drug C क्या होगा? Is a competitive inhibitor. It is a competitive inhibitor. Competitive is a non-competitive. Drug D is a non-competitive. मतलब क्या है? So less dose of drug is required. No, it is a more potent, but not equally active. Equally active नहीं है. B and C of curve to the right side, known as a antagonism, shifting of to log dose versus response curve towards the left side as a potentiation, and if shift is up in a parallel way, as a competitive inhibition, or if shift is in a non-parallel way, known as a non-competitive inhibition. Now drug response curve, dose response curve वेगळा आहे, और DRC मतलब drug response curve, and here is a dose response curve. What is that? Dose response curve is nothing but is a graph, and a graph of x-axis is a dose of drug on a x-axis and response or effect on a y-axis. There's a two part. ये दो part है. Dose plasma concentration curve, dose plasma concentration curve, and plasma concentration versus response curve. Plasma drug concentration is more closely related to the response, and usually it is known as a DRC, drug response curve. There are two type of drug response curve. एक होता है quantal DRC, quantal drug response curve, and second होता है graded drug response curve. There are two type of drug response curve. एक होता है quantal drug response curve, होता है graded response curve, graded DRC, quantal DRC, drug response curve. Now first one is a quantal drug response curve. क्वेश्चन आ चुका है इसके ऊपर एक बार. सो है क्वांटल ड्रग रिस्पॉन्स कर्व. मतलब इसमें क्या है, द रिस्पॉन्स जो होता है ऑन वाई एक्सिस, दैट इज टेकन आइदर ऑल और नन. तो यहाँ पे एक तो इफेक्ट जो है ऑल इफेक्ट कंसिडर किया जाएगा, और फिर नो, आइदर इफेक्ट और नो इफेक्ट, आइदर इफेक्ट और नो इफेक्ट. जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल एंटी इमेटिक ड्रग, dose of anti-emetic drug on x-axis, and whether it will stop vomiting or not, that will be a response on y-axis. Such type of response curve is known as a quantal response curve, quantal drug response curve. मतलब either all or none. इसके ऊपर क्वेश्चन आ चुका है जीपीएट में. So the response will be considered as either all or none, means there will be either effect or no effect. तो एंटीमेटिक ड्रग अगर देते हैं तो उसने वोमिटिंग स्टॉप करना चाहिए. अगर वोमिटिंग स्टॉप करता है तो उसका इफेक्ट है, नहीं करते तो नहीं है. तो है ना, आइदर यस और नो. क्वांटल ड्रग, क्वांटल है ना, ऑन एक्सिस, ऑन वाई एक्सिस you will have response, on x axis you have plasma drug concentration, and this quantal drug response curve is used to calculate the ED50 and LD50, and in turns that will give you therapeutic index. मतलब LD50 कैलकुलेट करने के लिए कौन सा ड्रग रिस्पॉन्स कर्व होता है? क्वांटल, ED50 एंड थेरेपेटिक इंडेक्स. थेरेपेटिक इंडेक्स से है What is therapeutic index? It is the ratio of 50 to the EDP. कई ratio है ना. Quantal response curve. Second is nothing but the graded drug response curve. Median, what is it? We have already seen this definition. Median effective dose that will be effective in a 50% population. Median lethal dose that can kill the 50% of population. We have seen. Therapeutic index is the ratio of LD50 divided by 8. और भी multiple times question आ चुका है, multiple times. It is a indicator of safety of drug, margin of safety. Second is a graded response curve. Graded drug response curve. यहाँ पे जो response होगा, response can be graded. जैसे for example, response can be graded. Example, decrease in the blood pressure. Is in the blood pressure. Say, if there is a hypertensive patient, how much decrease in the blood pressure is by that antihypertensive drug? 10%, 20%, 30%, 40%, 50%, like that. Grades, you know. So response can be a graded. A plot of magnitude of response. A plot of magnitude of response on a y-axis, log dose on a x-axis. It will give you a usually hyperbola. So in case of graded response curve, the curve will be a hyperbola in a shape, hyperbola in a shape. For a good mathematical comparison, dose is converted into log dose, greater log DRC. Will give you sigmoid shaped curve. Give you sigmoid shaped. तो ये ग्रेडेड डोज रिस्पॉन्स का वो हाइपरबोला देगा आपको. इफ यू प्लॉट अ लॉग डोज दैट विल गिव यू शेप करो. इसमें जो मिडल स्ट्रेट लाइन देगा दैट इज इंपॉर्टेंट फॉर थेरेपेटिक. Another reason to convert log dose or simple dose into log dose is a large variation. Large variation in doses can be plotted same curve. We have already seen the terms like what do you mean by efficacy, intrinsic activity. Slope of curve can be determined. Potency, efficacy that can be given. What is potency? That is related to dose produces the response. What do you mean by potency? It is the ability of drug to produce a response. Drug A and drug B is there. If both produces the same response, so drug A, drug A, drug B, drug A, drug B is there, it produces the same response. But dose of drug A is a 10 milligram and drug B is a 3 milligram. Means 10 milligram drug A produces the X effect and same effect, that is X effect, is produced by B drug which is 50 milligram. So drug A will be more potent. Drug A will be more potent. Drug A will be called as more potent than drug. Potency. Potency is related with the dose. Efficacy matlab it is a maximum effect produced by. More peak of the curve, more will be efficacy. Clearly it is important, more important than potency. Efficacy ज़्यादा important है. Slope जो है, slope curve graded dose response curve का DRC is a steep. Steep अगर curve है तो response dramatically increase with the slight increasing the dose. If drug which is having steeper DRC are having narrow therapeutic index. जैसे for example barbiturates है, the therapeutic index कम है, margin of safety कम has a steep dose response. Then having flat drug response. Benzodiazepine का response curve flat होता है, barbiturates का steep होता है. ये I will explain this with diagram. Competitive inhibitor, non-competitive inhibitor. Competitive inhibitor will decrease the and a competitive inhibitor will shift the drug response curve towards the right side in a parallel way. Question उसके ऊपर आ चुका है. Non-competitive inhibitor will not we'll also shift the curve to the right side, but not in a parallel way. Now this is a response, and if you take a log dose versus response curve, there are two drug A and drug B. say मान लीजिए this is a benzodiazepine, this is a barbiturates. So steep curve means what? Sudden increase in the concentration. Steep curve जल्दी ये एब्सॉर्ब हो गए, पीक लेवल जब देगा. फ्लैट डीआर से मतलब क्या? जल्दी पीक लेवल देगा नहीं. Steep drug which is having steep drug response curve is having less safety of margin. जो भी ड्रग आपका स्टीप ड्रग रिस्पॉन्स कर्व देगा, दैट हैज अ नैरो थेरेपेटिक्स, दैट हैज अ नैरो थेरेपेटिक मार्जिन. में थोड़ा सा भी ज़्यादा डोज हो गए तो फिट बहुत ज़्यादा होता है. ड्रग बी एंड ड्रग विच आर हैविंग फ्लैट टीआरसी, दे आर लिटरली सेफ. तो है ना, फर्स्ट ऑर्डर काइनेटिक्स अगर है तो टू रीच ए, फर्स्ट ऑर्डर काइनेटिक्स मतलब क्या है? फर्स्ट ऑर्डर काइनेटिक्स मतलब है एक कांस्टेंट percentage of drug or constant fraction of drug will be removed which is dependent on plasma concentration. मान लीजिए यहाँ पे 100 mg/ml concentration है ड्रग का, वो फर्स्ट हाफ टाइप में 8% concentration गिरेगा, मतलब रहेगा 50 mg. उसके बाद में 50 है, अभी प्लाज्मा में concentration 50 है. सेकंड हाफ लाइफ में उसका परसेंट गिरेगा, 25 mg. थर्ड हाफ लाइफ में उसका 50% गिरेगा, 12.5. लाइक दिस. मतलब इन अ फर्स्ट ऑर्डर काइनेटिक्स, तो ड्रग विल बी एलिमिनेटेड इन अ कांस्टेंट परसेंटेज based upon the plasma concentration in the and even to reach a steady state concentration you need a 3 to 4 half life. क्वेश्चन आ चुका था, to get a steady state concentration follows the first order reaction. So how many half lives are required? 3 to 4 half lives. 2 half lives for absorption. 4 half lives. Now types of antagonism, इसके ऊपर भी क्वेश्चन आ चुका है. तो जैसे कॉम्पिटिटिव नॉन कॉम्पिटिटिव हो गया, बट इन अ फार्माकोलॉजी तो देयर आर डिफरेंट टाइप ऑफ एंटागोनिज्म. लाइक फर्स्ट वन इज अ फिजिकल एंटागोनिज्म. इसके ऊपर मल्टीपल टाइम्स क्वेश्चन आ चुका है. टाइप्स ऑफ एंटागोनिज्म. फिजिकल एंटागोनिज्म, केमिकल एंटागोनिज्म, देन फिजियोलॉजिकल एंटागोनिज्म, एंड फोर्थ वन इज अ फार्माकोलॉजिकल एंटागोनिज्म. ये 4 टाइप के एंटागोनिज्म होते हैं. एक होता है फिजिकल एंटागोनिज्म, एक होता है केमिकल एंटागोनिज्म, एक होता है फिजियोलॉजिकल एंटागोनिज्म, एक होता है फार्माकोलॉजिकल एंटागोनिज्म. फिजिकल एंटागोनिज्म मतलब क्या है कि यहाँ पे है ना, टू ड्रग्स देयर, है ना, वन ड्रग इज एंटागोनिस्ट टू अनदर बिकॉज ऑफ इट्स फिजिकल एक्शन. जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल चारकोल इज यूज्ड इन केस ऑफ अल्कोलॉइडल पॉइजनिंग, बट चारकोल इज नॉट अ ड्रग. चारकोल decreases the alkaloidal poisoning because of its physical action. Charcoal prevents the absorption of alkaloid from the stomach by absorbing alkaloids on its surface. जो एक्टिवेटेड चारकोल होता है, जब आप पॉइजनिंग में देते हैं, एक्टिवेटेड चारकोल क्या करेगा, जो स्टमक में अनएब्सॉर्ब पॉइजन है, जो ब्लड में एब्सॉर्ब नहीं हुआ है स्टमक में, ये वो उसको एब्सॉर्ब कर लेगा सरफेस के ऊपर. दैट इज बिकॉज ऑफ इट्स फिजिकल एक्शन. So it is a physical type of antagonism. Chemical antagonism. So chemical antagonism means due to chemical properties. जैसे for example, EDTA, ethylene diamine tetraestic acid, is used as an antidote for heavy metal poisoning. Heavy metal poisoning के लिए antidote कौन use करते हैं mostly? ये EDTA. How EDTA? Because is a hexadentate, it will chelate, it will form a bonds with the 6 metal ions. So that's because of the chemical property. So chemical antagonism. Right? Now what do you mean by physiological antagonism? इसके ऊपर 2 बार क्वेश्चन आ चुका है. Times in the GPAT, 2-3 times in the government drug inspector. What is physiological antagonism? Physiological antagonism is if two drug produces the opposite pharmacological action by binding to a different receptor. By binding to a different receptor. The opposite effect करेंगे, they will produce opposite effect, but they will have their own receptors. So for example, noradrenaline will increase the blood pressure by acting on a alpha 1 receptor, beta 1 receptor. But acetylcholine will decrease the blood pressure by acting on a muscarinic receptor. So likewise that. So adrenaline, है ना? This is for example, another example. For example, histamine by interacting with the H1 receptor produces the bronchoconstriction. Adrenaline by interacting with beta 2 receptor produces bronchodilation. Histamine का receptor है H1 receptor, है ना? और एड्रेनालिन का है बीटा रिसेप्टर, बीटा 2 रिसेप्टर. तो ब्रोंकोकंस्ट्रिक्शन करता है हिस्टामाइन, ब्रोंकोडाइलेशन करता है एड्रेनालिन. एड्रेनालिन एंड हिस्टामाइन दे कैन बी कॉल्ड एज अ फिजियोलॉजिकल एंटागोनिस्ट. और द अस्थमा प्रोड्यूस्ड बाय हिस्टामाइन इज रिलीव्ड बाय एड्रेनालिन. तो टाइप ऑफ एंटागोनिज्म इज अ फिजियोलॉजिकल. मतलब क्या कि यहाँ पे अपोजिट effect is produced by two agents and they have their own receptors. Type of antagonism is physiological antagonism. Now fourth one is a pharmacological antagonism. यहाँ पे क्या है? Opposite pharmacological effect by binding to a same receptor. यहाँ पे क्या है? Same receptor. जैसे for example noradrenaline by interacting with the beta receptor is the blood pressure. Beta blocker like propranolol blocks the receptor, same receptor, and decreases the blood pressure. So opposite action interacting with the same receptor known as a pharmacological antagonist. Now opposite action by interacting with a different receptor known as a physiological antagonist. And pharmacological antagonism is a full of pharmacology. Noradrenaline and beta blockers, noradrenaline and alpha blockers, acetylcholine and muscarinic antagonist, है ना, histamine and antihistaminics. All they are the examples of pharmacological antagonism. So remember there are a different type of antagonism: physical antagonism, chemical antagonism, physiological antagonism, and pharmacological antagonism. Now next is a adverse drug reaction. One is a adverse drug reactions. पर मैं रिपीट करता हूँ. Type of antagonism: physical antagonism because of the its physical action. For example, charcoal used in the alkaloids poisoning act by preventing the absorption of alkaloid. Here is a physical antagonism. Chemical antagonism is of the chemical action. EDTA act as an antidote for heavy metal because EDTA will chelate the heavy metal. It's is a chemical property of EDTA. इथिलीन डायअमाइन टेट्राएसिटिक एसिड ये क्या करता है? हेवी मेटल्स को चिलेट करता है, बॉन्ड फॉर्म करता है ना, एंड दैट्स हाउ इट डिक्रीजेस द पॉइजनिंग. सो दैट इज अ केमिकल एंटागोनिज्म. फिजियोलॉजिकल एंटागोनिज्म मतलब क्या है? तो टू एजेंट प्रोड्यूसेस द ऑपोजिट इफेक्ट by interacting with the different receptor. Say histamine is a classical example. Histamine and adrenaline. Question multiple. Histamine produces the bronchoconstriction. This is the bronchoconstriction by interacting with the H1 receptor. Adrenaline relieves the bronchoconstriction, means it produces the bronchodilation by interacting with the beta-2 receptor. So they produce the opposite effect by interacting with the different receptor. Physiological antagonism. Pharmacological antagonism मतलब क्या है? So they produce the opposite effect by interacting on the same receptor. So for example, noradrenaline by interacting with alpha receptor increases the blood pressure. Alpha blocker like prazosin by blocking the alpha 1 receptor decreases the blood pressure. So noradrenaline and prazosin, they are the pharmacological antagonists. Noradrenaline by interacting with the beta receptor increases the blood pressure. Beta blocker like atenolol, propranolol, they decreases the blood pressure by blocking the same receptor. तो receptor अलग अलग है, physiological antagonism. Receptor एक ही है, तो pharmacological antagonism. Now we'll see the adverse drug reaction. What is meant by adverse drug reaction? Any noxious or undesired effect of a drug. Any noxious undesired effect of a drug when used in the prophylaxis or diagnosis or treatment known as adverse drug reaction. मतलब if drug क्यों ले रहे हैं? If you are getting a pain, so we are taking a painkiller to decrease the pain. तो उसने pain ही decrease करना चाहिए. It should decrease pain only. It should not produce any other effect. Any other effect than desired one. If you are taking paracetamol for a fever, to decrease the fever is a desired effect of paracetamol. So if it produces other effect than decreasing the body temperature, a fever, that other effect is considered as a adverse drug reaction. Any noxious undesired effect of a drug when drug is used in the treatment, diagnosis or prophylaxis known as a adverse drug reaction. So there is one department of pharmacology that is known as a pharmacovigilance that deals with the epidemiological study of adverse drug reaction. इसके ऊपर क्वेश्चन आ चुका. Now adverse drug reaction, so there are different terms we use randomly to denote the adverse drug reaction. अपन adverse drug reaction बोलने के लिए कुछ terms use करते हैं, but वो terms अलग अलग होते हैं. जैसे for example side effect, then there is a untoward effect, and there is a toxic effect. These all three effects are the used to denote the, these all three terms are used to denote the adverse effect, but they are different little bit. तीनों टर्म एडवर्स ड्रग रिएक्शन को ही दर्शाता है, लेकिन अलग अलग है. जैसे फॉर एग्जांपल व्हाट डू यू मीन बाय एडवर्स इफेक्ट? एडवर्स इफेक्ट, they are predictable. They may or may not be extension of pharmacological effect. Say for example dryness of mouth caused by atropine. You know that atropine is a anticholinergic drug. It is an anti-muscarinic drug. Obviously it will block the all the secretions. So ये dryness of mouth करेगा ही करेगा. You can predict. You can say dryness of mouth caused by atropine is a side effect. Now untoward effect क्या होता है? Untoward effect is undesired effect produced by a therapeutic dose of drug. है ना? जैसे पोटेशियम लॉस ड्यू टू डायरेटिक. अगर आपको डायरेटिक चालू है तो पोटेशियम लॉस होगा. तो इट इज अनडिजायर्ड इफेक्ट produced by therapeutic dose. Is a untoward effect. What is meant by toxic effect? So due to the high dose of drug, say for example if you take morphine in a high dose, that can cause respiratory depression caused by morphine, है ना? or hepatotoxicity caused by paracetamol. Is a toxic effect. Now there is another term known as a intolerance. There is another term known as intolerance. What is intolerance? Failure to tolerate the drug is known as intolerance. इडियोसिंक्रेसी क्या है? इडियोसिंक्रेसी, तो इडियोसिंक्रेसी इज नथिंग बट द, तो काही नाही हो, लेक्चर मध्ये करो 5 मिनिट. Idiosyncrasy means it is again a unpredictable sudden adverse effect which is caused due to your genetic makeup. And allergy is also there. We'll see the remaining points tomorrow. Types of adverse drug reaction and all that. Discuss tomorrow. I hope you have understood today. Tomorrow we'll see the remaining points. And everybody should join tomorrow. आज कम है, कल सभी join करो.